we'll start with that, a little primer. So first of all, I use the word selfing a lot, yes? Selfing? Which for me is what's going on in the head with the thought system. Yeah? And selfing implies just that. If listened to, if there's a hearing of it and a listening to it. The listening to it is different. There's a focused attention when it's listening. Hearing, it's just hearing, yes? But listening to selfing produces an effect, and that is the sense of being a self, yeah? The feeling of being a long-lasting, independent, separate entity. And now that feeling wasn't there when you were first born for a while, yeah? So it's come later, so it actually had to be produced. In other words, when you were babies, there was no sense of being a self, you know, for the first year and a half of being a baby. But then the mental process that produces the sense of self started to kick in, and that production is the feeling of being a self. Yeah? The feeling of being a self. So when some people, so selfing is a word I like to use a lot. And I use the word mind, not meaning conditional mind, but the mind as referred to in old Zen from China, Chan, mind, meaning, I don't know what it means, but it's just mind. Yeah? Some people would call it consciousness or awareness, but I like the word mind. So I use that word a lot. And then the selfing. And when I say selfing, when people are talking about, oh, the selfing's driving me crazy, what's driving you crazy is the feeling of being the one who's driven crazy, not the selfing. The selfing is just a mental process. It's just like a process, like when you go to the bathroom, when you piss, you just don't piss once your whole life, do you? It's pissing a lot, yeah? You shit, you just don't shit once, and all right. My first and only shit was in 1998, you know? A rather large one, but it's over. That's it. I'm done shitting, yes? It's like I'm done breathing. I breathed once and that was it, you know? All of these functions of the body, voluntary and involuntary, many of them aren't many of them aren't voluntary. There's just one that's half voluntary, involuntary, which is breath. Most of the others are involuntary. They go on and on and on. They're like a verb, yes? You don't do it once and that's it. Yeah, so the idea of selfing is just like that. Selfing continues because selfing is the act of the conditional mind trying to become what it can never be. Yeah? It can never be a long-lasting, independent, separate entity. So the way it appears to be is constantly becoming. That's why it's yapping all the time. Yes? If the yapping would stop, if it would seriously stop, there would be an absence or a pause in the production of the feeling of being a self. And like they would say in Zen, you would see your original face in that moment. Yeah? You would see yourself as being what you are, which is no thingness. Yeah? But because the selfing continues and continues and continues, because it can never complete fulfillment, because it never can become what it's trying to become, because it isn't so. There is not a long-lasting, independent, separate entity. And no matter how much becoming occurs, it's never going to become that. Yeah? So it's always a becoming, a verb, and that's called selfing, the way I see it. Yeah? And everything for me is a verb. But what happens with the selfing, if listened to, it sounds like you were there before the selfing. Yeah? That's the historical feeling that's produced. So it's a product of a process, but the product thinks it's before the process. Yeah? So you believe you're there before the selfing, during the selfing, and after the selfing. There's a vague sense of being you. Yeah? So there's a historical feeling, but that's produced. It's not so. It's not authentic. It's produced. It's produced by listening, not hearing to the selfing, because hearing is what you do. You're conscious. So hearing is going to occur. You're going to hear, in a sense, hear and see the thoughts, yes? But it's listening that's the addiction to self. So when the mind listens to the selfing, that's its addiction to self, and that's, I would say, is the primary addiction. Mind is addicted to self. What occurs is, when mind is addicted to self, it sets off an irritability, restlessness, and discontent, because it's trying to rely on something that's unreliable. There isn't a self. Yeah? So it's sort of like we were talking about last night. You go to those motels, I don't know if you ever went to them, I did, where you get like a quarter and you put it in, it's like a massager bed, and it's basically just agitation, but it's saying it's supposed to be relaxing. But that's sort of like mind is like when it's resting on the idea of being a self. there is no self, so it's anxious, very anxious about that. And that anxiety is producing irritability, restlessness, and discontent, and therefore the engine of seeking is turned on. And the seeking will never cease, because what it's looking for is fulfillment to become what it can never be. So it's never going to end seeking. You can see it in a lot of spiritual practices. Some people believe they've achieved enlightenment, and then they're on to the next enlightenment. I've met people that have been enlightened 3 times this life. How much enlightenment do you need? Yeah? I mean, I would think one would do it. But now they're moving on and on and on, because the engine of becoming can never fulfill itself. It can never be. Yet at the same moment, there is being. Yeah? There is being. The being is always available at the same moment, which is every moment, that selfing is occurring or not occurring. The being is the primary context. So when the mind starts resting on the being, instead of self-centered, it's now centered. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And it's now resting on something that's reliable, so it can truly rest. Even if it's very, quote-unquote, busy and active, there's a rest there. A rest that the sense of self can never find. I don't care if you get 5 massages a day. You're never going to drop into this state of relaxation that happens when the mind is centered. I would say on mind, not on self. Remember, the self is an idea of a very small application of mind, a mental process, produces the idea of selfing. Very small. And so the product of that system can't transcend the system. It doesn't exist anywhere but in the system. It only exists in the phantom world of there, then, here and now, past, future, yes? Or the mental here. The mental here is not here. The mental here is just like a combination of there and then. Yeah? So when you're thinking you're mentally here, when you're in the mental here, you're in a past event and with a future speculation. There's no here whatsoever. It's all made up. Yeah? So when there's a center on the center, yes, that rest is available, the mind becomes somewhat at peace, and the first thing that starts occurring is the seeking. The engine of seeking starts being dismissed, yes? It starts losing its juice, because what's keeping it driven is the attention and interest of the mind, yeah? And the attention and interest of the mind is usually focused by what it thinks it is. So if it thinks it's a body, you're going to be very interested in the story of you as an action figure, yeah? And yet if someone comes over to you and talks about their story of themselves being an action figure, you seem to have an immunity to that, yeah? I could be sitting right next to someone who's totally flipping out, but it's not like contagious. I don't start flipping out, yeah? Because there's a certain built-in immunity, because I hold them as their thoughts, yeah? The same thoughts that are seemingly driving her crazy, if I hold them as mine, they will drive me crazy, probably, yeah? If I can see them as hers, they don't drive me crazy. So what's really driving you crazy? It isn't the thoughts, is it? It's the identification as being the thinker of them, or the identification as being the object of them. Yeah? This is called the bondage of self. Yeah? You're not bonded to the... What's the bondage isn't of self, it's to self, in a way. Because there is no self, but you're bonded to the idea of being a self. Yeah? And that bondage constantly has to be... new glue has to be applied to keep the bondage, because it's not a natural bondage. Yes? First, there'd have to be a something to be bonded to something else. I'm saying we're no thing. So there's nothing that can be bonded to no thing. Yes? But the idea of being a something, this body, is what the mind is now bonded to by the selfing. Yeah? So your interest, attention, circles around you as the central character of the story of life. So we don't see it as life is happening, we see it as it's happening to me. It's an insane self-centered loop. Yeah? It actually drives the mind crazy. And you see the craziness by the incessant seeking. It's constantly looking for relief. Yeah? But it's trying to find relief for instead of from. Yeah? If you're identified as this idea of being a self, you'll try to become free as a self instead of being freed from self. It's totally different. I don't believe you'll ever be free as a self. It's an impossibility.